Welcome, everybody. We actually have one substitution. My friend and colleague, Professor Shireen Joshi from Georgetown, is joining us this afternoon as well. Thanks, everybody, for coming. When they first asked us a couple of months ago to put together a panel, think about a panel on the world is better than you think, that seemed like a daunting task 2 or 3 months ago. I must say in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it seems even more daunting to think about the world in that way. But in fact, in many, many ways, this is kind of a golden age around the world where in terms of poverty, in terms of education, in terms of empowerment of women, in terms of health, in terms of a reduction in conflict, the world is actually in much better shape than it has been ever. That's not to dismiss or discount the very negative things that are going on. I don't think anyone here on the panel would say some of the negative things aren't happening, but there's an imbalance, I think, in the information that we hear and what we see, with so much attention being given to the negative things around the world and the challenges that we face, and very little attention being given to the more positive trends and what we can learn from them and how that can help us make the world an even better place going forward. So we're going to keep this as an open discussion and hopefully get some questions from all of you as well. What I want to do is just start with each of the panelists and ask them kind of the question that you just responded to, what they think is the single most important thing that's happened in the world that is underappreciated by most people around the world. And we'll start with you, Michael.
You know, I guess I'd probably say that a decline in global poverty is the most significant development in the last 5 years. Just the impact of that, I think, on democracy, the impact of that on stability, the impact on just people's lives. People's lives are just improved by it. I think to me, it's the most important development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the numbers on this are huge. Using a poverty line of $1.90 a day, which is what the World Bank uses, there are about 2 billion people living in poverty, living below that poverty line around the world in the mid-1990s, 1993. And by the latest estimates, we're down to around 650 million people. So 1.3 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 2 decades. And of course, nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. In fact, up until the 1990s, that number was ever rising with global population. So actually, even just having it level off is a big deal, but it fell by 1.3 billion in just 20 years. It's pretty amazing. Bobby, what do you think?
I think you would definitely pick that out in terms of impact on the global population. And the thing that we know from lots of the studies is that people don't recognize that. So when you ask them around the world, my background was in survey research, and when you ask them around the world, half of people think that extreme poverty has doubled. Mm-hmm. Only 8% of people think that it's halved. So we've got this complete inversion of the reality, and that's where you get findings like only 1 in 10 people think that the world is getting better, whereas 7 in 10 people think the world is getting worse. So we've got this enormous negativity bias, which is really important to understand because it colors so much more. And exactly as your intro points out, Steve, this is not about saying everything is perfect. It's recognizing that the bigger danger is our tendency to see everything as bad and going downhill. And that's the thing that we need to fight against, because that ends up in bad decisions.
Good. That's a quick overview of a book that Bobby is coming out with in November with the great title of Why We Are Wrong About Nearly Everything. It's going to come out in November with basic books, and so he'll elaborate on that in great length. Shireen, what would you like to add?
Well, what I would say here is the steady expansion of opportunities for women and girls. You know, the female youth literacy rate, weighted average across the world right now, is above 90%. That's huge, considering, you know, my mother's generation or my grandmother's generation, especially, you know, back in my hometown of India, it was half of that, and maybe even a third of that. So if you look at primary schooling enrollment rates, they're at the 100% and beyond if you include all the overage students. So primary education for girls is almost universal worldwide, and secondary school education is also up to 75%. And again, in 1990, it was half of that. So
And this is so powerful, and it's interesting, actually, on the 4 that you voted on, this was not among your choices. And it's so powerful, the education and empowerment of girls and women, because of the intergenerational effect. We know from abundant research, and Shireen knows this research than I do, but we know from abundant research that when you educate a girl, she will tend to get married later, she'll have fewer children, those children will be healthier, those children are more likely to go to school, those children are more likely to get a job themselves and be better educated. And so by educating girls today, we are already planting powerful seeds for progress continuing 30 years from now, when they are parents and adults and their children are going into school. So it's one of the reasons that I feel more positive about the trends in the world, because so many future mothers are getting that opportunity now, and there's really no more powerful intergenerational impact than that. Marion.
Counterintuitively, resources are becoming more abundant, affordable, from the perspective of earning power of ordinary people. In spite of 250 years of intensive economic growth, firstly in the West and then in the rest, actually the prices of natural resources continue to fall. Recently at the Simon Project, which I run, we looked at 50 commodities over the last, prices of 50 commodities as tracked by the World Bank and the IMF over the last 40 years. And we found that on average, the price of natural resources fell by 70%. Interestingly enough, over the same period of time, global population increased by 70%. There is an almost exact trade-off. As population grows, resources are becoming less abundant because people are coming up with more ideas about how to get to those resources, how to recycle them, and so forth. So when you hear Ocasio-Cortez ask a question like, is it still okay to have babies? Or Bill Maher, who says, the best thing you can do for the world is to die and stay dead, I would say the opposite. Humanity is managing to cope with the demand for resources and actually making them more abundant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so interesting because the take on that is so different, especially from 20 or 30 years ago when all of the talk was that we were going to run out of some key resources, and that wasn't the case then, but it's clearly not the case on that. But let me ask you a follow-up, because I think it's probably in a lot of people's mind, how that interplays with climate change, which of course is such a big challenge going forward, but how in your does the natural resources becoming cheaper and more abundant play into the concerns about climate change?
Well, at the root of the project was really to try to find the answer to the question of how are human numbers and natural resources related to one another. But you could make the same argument about climate change and global warming, which is to say that you can take one of two approaches. You can take the more restrictive approach and ask people around the world, including 1.5 billion people in India and another 1.5 billion people in China, to limit their consumption. Or you can rely on human ingenuity to come up with answers to the most pressing questions that humanity faces. Abundance of natural resources is one of them. Technical optimism and developing technical solutions to the problem of global warming and climate change is another. So I would say higher education rates combined with continued investment in research and development equals technological solutions to producing energy with less of an environmental impact. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Good. On this list of things that are going well, there's actually many other things that could be added. My favorite is related to the longevity, people living longer, but it's about infant mortality and infant death. And the rate of infant death for the share of children that die before their 5th birthday has fallen since 1960 from 22% children dying before their 5th birthday in developing countries, 22%, down to around 5% today. So instead of 1 out of 5 children dying before their 5th birthday, we're down to about 1 out of 20 children dying before their 5th birthday. And what's remarkable about that is that the rate of infant mortality has fallen in every single country in the world since the 1980s. No exceptions. I'm not going to say except Sudan or except Afghanistan or except anywhere else. It has fallen in every single country in the world. And I don't know any other socioeconomic indicator that has improved in every single country in the world at the same time ever in human history. But infant mortality rates, child mortality rates have done just that. And there are many others. Conflict and war is actually near low levels, global historical levels. Steven Pinker's work and others have focused on that. Democracy has spread more than it has ever before, although in the last 4 or 5 years we've seen a retrogression in that. But there are many other indicators that are on the positive side. But most people, as you mentioned earlier, both Michael and Bobby mentioned this, that most people don't get it, don't see it, don't understand it, actually think quite the opposite. Bobby, you mentioned that in particular. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people get it wrong?
Yeah, well, in the book and in other analysis around this, what you have to do is split it into 2 effects, 2 big buckets of effects. It's what we're told, the information environment that we're in, but it's also what we think, the biases and heuristics that we have as individuals. It's both of those things working together, not independently. So just taking an example of the extreme poverty, you could have run a headline every day for the last 25 years, as Max Rosa and others have pointed out. 137,000 people escape from extreme poverty every single day for the last 25 years. But they don't do that, the media don't do that, because we're not interested in that kind of boring, incremental positive move. They know that. We've seen that in other experiments with positive media coverage. It just doesn't work. Media outlets that try and dedicate themselves to positive news only don't work. And it's partly because of the way our brains work. It is the biases that we have, where we have a natural focus on negative information, which is not a dumb fault of our brain. That's kind of an evolutionary element to it. Because in our cave people past, negative information was often more urgent information that you had to act on. It was about threat. So we actually literally process negative information differently in our brains. Lots of great experiments have shown that our brains light up in different places and in different ways when confronted with negative information. Then the second key bias that we have is something called rosy retrospection, where we think the past was better than it was because we literally forget the bad bits.
Right.
And there's some
good
great,
old days.
The good old days. The good old days. Great experiments. Terence Mitchell and other US professors done work following people before their vacations, during them and after. And we all go in the same sort of pattern of excited anticipation. Then you get there and there's some minor niggles. It's a bit of a letdown. That doesn't all quite go to plan. And you come back mildly disappointed with your vacation. But then he kept interviewing them. Him and his team kept interviewing them over time. And over time, the memories grew fonder. People kind of looked back on it and they could only remember the long walks on the beach. They couldn't remember the kids being sick in the car or all those other things, that, like minor niggles that went wrong. We literally forget. Again, not a dumb fault of our brain, something useful for us. We don't want to hold on to those minor regrets. The trouble is, as a negative side effect, because we've got this natural tendency to think the present and the future is worse than it is because we've got this rosy view of the past. And that's where people play on that. Politicians, some elements of the media, will play on that natural sense that everything is going downhill in order to tell people nothing's, we should rip it up. There's no risk in ripping things up if you think it's all going downhill. And that's part of the issue. That's probably the big risk for this negativity bias, combined with a rosy retrospection, combined with a media and political environment that knows what we like naturally and kind of automatically gives it to us, is it creates this system where we're stuck in this system of this negative view, negative and downhill view. And that's kind of those things interacting.
Right.
Sounds really scary. But actually recognizing that, you can start to think, what can we do about it?
We do. Yeah, my wife's grandmother, before she passed, she used to say, the hell with the good old days. I used to have to wash the dishes by hand, do the laundry by hand, and walk to the grocery store every day. That wasn't so good.
Exactly.
Shireen, why do you think, and then we'll come back here, why do you think that people miss it in terms of what's going well in the world?
Well, I think when it comes to the expansion of opportunities for women, it's a little different than what you just described. I think there are two comparison groups, right? One is women today comparing themselves to previous generations. I do think they think about that, because previous generations are there, mothers, grandmothers, as you said, that conversation is a perfect example. There, I think there is a high level of awareness. But there's another comparison group, right? Which is there's also been an expansion of opportunities for men. And there, the real issue is that gap remains, inequality remains. We're still having conversations about, women's wages and basic, rights the workplace and so on. So I think it's been hard to applaud the strides made in the expansion of opportunities for women, because even though we see it, because the gap that remains looms large.
Good.
And I think that's the challenge.
Michael, as a journalist, what's your perspective on this?
Well, it's funny because my day job is writing about national U.S. politics, so it's sort of remarkable that I think the world is getting better having that as my day job. Somehow I do. But in 2016, when I was covering the presidential campaign, I was in New Hampshire in January, and I went to an event with Chris Christie. It was a town hall in New Hampshire, in this little town called Pittsfield, which is about an hour north of Manchester. If any of you have been there, please raise your hand, but I doubt any of you have. Christie did his spiel, and he talked a lot about terrorism and ISIS, and said things like you can't have civil liberties if you're in a coffin, things like that. And when I finished, I asked this woman next to me, I said, "What'd you think?" And she was pretty meh. She wasn't really impressed with what he had to say. And I said, "Well, what issue really concerns you the most?" And she said, "Oh, ISIS. I'm very worried about ISIS." And she said that they could come here, and I'm worried about my kids and my grandkids. I thought to myself, I'm in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. I seriously doubt if ISIS were to come to the United States, they were going to hit Pittsfield, New Hampshire. But she was genuinely most fearful about this. And keep in mind, this is in New Hampshire, which had a serious, and still has a serious opiate crisis. This is a state that has a good number of gun deaths, as every state in America does. And this wasn't something that she has developed organically on her own to be worried about ISIS. She was convinced of this by politicians who told her that she should be scared about ISIS. And so I think a lot of what drives this sort of fear-mongering in the sense that things are very dangerous out there is that the messages that people hear constantly from politicians, from the media, is that we should be afraid, is that it's a dangerous world, it's more dangerous than ever. And the people out there who get up and say, actually, you know what, things are pretty good, are few and far between. And I think, for what it's worth also, that we have an entire sort of infrastructure in the national security realm, the foreign policy realm, that tends to be pessimistic because that's frankly better for, I say better for business, but also better for the things they care about. It's very hard for people to pay attention to your issue if you say, things are pretty good, but we should focus on this. It's a lot easier if you say, things are pretty bad, it's a crisis even, or it's a threat to America, and we should worry about it. And so I think that drives a lot of the narrative around this idea of this being a very dangerous world we live in.
Let me ask you a follow-up, and then I want to get Marion involved in this. Some people blame the press. One take is it's the press. They have a negativity bias. It sells newspapers. If it bleeds, it leads. But the counter-argument, or a different argument, is no, the press is just reflecting what people want to consume, what they want to read about. They're not interested in that. And is it both of those? Is it a little, what's your take on these different roles of the press in this?
I think if it bleeds, it leads kind of works for local news and it works for national news, international news also. But I just think a lot of people are just sort of misinformed about this. I mean, I think that you look at who goes on television, it tends to be folks from the military, tends to be pundits who tend to focus on the negative. You don't get people going on television and say everything is okay. And I've actually been struck by the debate around what's happening right now with ISIS in northern Syria. Everyone I see on television talking about this, saying ISIS is going to reconstitute themselves, they're a threat. I just feel like somebody should mention the fact that no ISIS fighter has ever staged a terrorist attack on American soil. It's never happened. And it's being portrayed as this sort of incredible existential threat to America from ISIS, when in reality, it really isn't a threat to America. I mean, I'm not in any way defending the policy in Syria or saying that ISIS is an organization that we shouldn't be dealing with, but it's not a threat. but the way that it's portrayed to people is as a threat. So I do think that there is a predisposition on the media's part to sort of toward, I think, pessimism and also to rely on voices who tend to be pessimistic and tend to have, frankly, an incentive to be pessimistic.
Marion?
Well, much good stuff has already been covered. I think Bobby is fundamentally right on the crux of the matter, which is that we have evolved to be pessimists. When you think of our species, potentially anywhere between 200 and 300,000 years old, prosperity has been around for about 200 years. Right. So that's 0.01% of our time on Earth. And Daniel Kahneman, one of the world's most prominent psychologists from Princeton, has a wonderful quote. He says, "Organisms that treat threats as more urgent than opportunities have a better chance to survive and reproduce." So he definitely bases our negativity bias in evolution. One comment on the news media. I think it's probably a bit of both, but psychological tests done in lab showed that even people who said that they were interested in positive news tended to track on screen the negative news. In other words, the eye is drawn to negative regardless. So, and one last thing I would say with regard to negativity, and that is that social media has certainly complicated matters. I'm not suggesting for a second that we shouldn't have them, because I do like technology. I think that Twitter and Facebook and so forth are very important in connecting the world. But at the same time, they make bad things very intimate and immediate. If there was a tsunami 300 years ago, you simply wouldn't know that 10,000 people in Japan have died in a terrible catastrophe. Now you can watch it live on the screen of your iPhone, and I think it makes people more vulnerable because it came to them, the distance has been diminished, and they can, and it's present in their minds, they cannot ignore it, as opposed to people before who have never learned about multitude of wars and catastrophes that have befallen humanity.
Yeah. Greg Easterbrook, who wrote a book called It's Better Than It Looks a few years ago, had a line on this issue about that to some extent we're wired to look at the negative for fear and to look out negatively at what might happen. And his line was, "The instinct that kept our ancestors alive now keeps journalists employed." So I thought that was a pretty good line. But I think another factor on this is that the good news, the types of trends that we're talking about, and we mentioned this on the poverty side, happen gradually over decades. They don't happen overnight. There's not really it's hard to think of really great news that can happen overnight. Occasionally, but whereas bad news often happens very abruptly, whether it's a typhoon or a storm or that kind of thing, or an attack or some kind of mass shooting or something, they happen overnight. And some of these longer trends that are positive, they're very gradual, and so people don't see them. As Bobby mentioned, it's not in the newspaper. That there is a difference in the time dimension over which many of these happen. So let me turn to, and I'll start with you, Marion. Why do we care? Why is it important that people get this right, or to turn that around? What's the risk if policymakers and citizens have too pessimistic a view and don't understand some of the positive trends in the world? What does it matter?
Well, I think fundamentally the issue is that if people think that world is going to hell, there's no reason for them to defend the economic and the political underpinnings of modern society. Mm-hmm. So if you think of modernity as being primarily defined as some form of free market capitalism or free enterprise, and if you think of the world today as being dominated by some form of liberal democracy or even just ordinary democracy, if people think that things are getting worse, they may think that free enterprise and democracy are not worth defending and embrace ideologies which present themselves as alternatives, but in fact may produce much worse results in the long run. Part of the issue here is that progress is retrospective. When I say that today is better than, I mean better than yesterday. And this goes back to what you were saying about women in India. They're better off than they were years ago, for certain. But are we falling short of an ideal? Yes, we are. And people who can present to the public an image of an ideal where everybody is free, where everybody is rich, where everybody is healthy, they have a very powerful picture to paint, even though it is utopian by its very definition.
Yeah, I think that's right. Shireen, jump in on this.
Yeah, I would say the important thing about looking back, right? I'm not just saying this as a scholar, but you have kind of one set of facts, sort of, right? Like you have, in history gives us a set of facts. If we start to live in a world where we don't look back and we don't think those facts, then we run a real risk that our interpretation of the world that we're in is tied to our identity, the social media that we consume, our social group, our localized cultural norms. And then we lose awareness of kind of how localized they are in the first place and how they tie in with those long-term trends. And I think maybe we're saying a similar thing, but that's the real risk, is you get these enclaves of beliefs that are disconnected from facts, that can persist. And I think we're living in a world right now, we're seeing this, right? Like whether it's all the issues we're talking about on the stage is we're not in agreement about the set of facts. So I think history, looking at the state of the world, looking at data, looking at, for example, where successes came from, is really important to inform how we think about where we are now and how to close the gap with where we see injustice today.
Yep. Bobby, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think Marion nailed it on terms of what's the negative implications, but Shireen's point is a really good one on how differently we see these realities and the extent to which in the polarization literature, it's called, you get differentiation, and then you get identification, then differentiation, then you get this perceptual bias. They're kind of the stages of polarization in terms of how people feel. And the perceptual bias one is really important because we end up seeing the same realities differently. So we asked one question in the US about what kills most people in the US. Is it guns, knives, or other violence? And 59% of people got the right answer, which is guns. It's like killed 68% of interpersonal violent deaths in the US are through guns, second only to Mexico. It's at 76%. So guns are very definitely the key cause of those options of interpersonal violent deaths. But that 59% was a balance between 83% of strong Democrats saying it was guns and 27% of strong Republicans saying it was guns. So the same social reality seen entirely differently depending on which group you were in. And those types of things where you actually start to see the basics of the world differently, and that's reinforced by political statements, and it's reinforced by the filter bubbles and echo chambers that you can increasingly live in. That's where you get into problems of we've got no common understanding of what's going on in the world, and that's a real issue.
Michael?
I sort of see it from a policy standpoint, because when you think about it from a U.S. national security standpoint, we think about what makes America safer. Well, the world being more peaceful, there being more democracy, there being more, liberal economic countries, more trade agreements, more interdependence. All that makes America safer, makes it stronger economically. All the things that contribute to that are the developments that we're talking about here, right? I mean, the more democracy there is, the more female empowerment there is, the more economic growth there is, the more chances are that you'll have access to education or healthcare. So it's in perspective that if we think of what makes us safer, the things that make us safer are not the billions spent on our military, actually many of these developments that we have contributed to, but we are contributing to less and less now. But I also think we don't understand how much better the world is. It allows us to, I think, view the world as being dangerous and thus leads to really bad policy decisions. And I think, obviously, if the last 18 years of the response to 9/11, I think sort of shows that. I mean, it is amazing to go back and read some of the speeches and statements that were made after 9/11 that presented the world as, you know, being at war with terrorism and war with tyranny and evildoers and so forth, and how just misguided that was, and how it presented to Americans a just incredibly distorted sense of what's happening in the world. But Americans believed it. They were told this for over and over again by policymakers, and I think it's what contributed to the incredibly flawed policies, that's putting it mildly, it came out of 9/11. And so I think, you know, when Americans understand, I think, how much better, safer the world is, and how limited these threats really are, how phantom these threats often are, and how, even though they're presented as such, I think it does make a difference on kind of policies that we implement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm struck in the United States, but also around the world, how the people on the far right and the far left are united with the starting point that the world is a mess and it's a disaster. They're actually quite similar in the starting points of what they say. It's awful. They differ, of course, in what should be done about it, what the prospects are, but they start from the whole system is a mess. And it's not to say that everything is great about the system. Nobody here would make that argument at all. There's a lot of challenges to be met. But any global system that has led to huge drop in poverty, the improvements in health, improvements in education, some big advancements in democracy, reduction in conflict, increases in trade and contacts around the world, it strikes me that we shouldn't throw the whole system out. We want to fix it and obviously improve it and make way for including China and India and other countries in the world in a coherent manner. But it is striking how people on the far left and the far right start with that same diagnosis, that everything is really wrong. And as a result, it leads to bad policies and bad prescriptions. So, Shireen, let me start with you. What can we do about it? How can we better inform people about these more positive trends, and that the world is not going to hell in a handbasket necessarily?
Well, more panels like this one. But I think, no, I think there's a real space for dialogue. You know, I feel that all these themes we've been touching on, when people talk to each other and don't wall themselves off in echo chambers. You know, I think about in India, local village democracy, right? Where the whole idea is at a Gram Sabha meeting, you know, firstly, India has reservations for women to be represented in local government, and that's a huge example of a policy along the lines of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But one of the aspects of the program is not just putting women in positions of authority at local village councils, but also having big village meetings where people are required to come, well, not required, it's optional, but people come, and there is dialogue and discussion about priorities, budgets, etc. And when you have a woman who is leading the council, women tend to show up, and the dialogue between those groups, you know, so I've been at village meetings where a woman gets elected, or, you know, there's a reservation policy, and all the women of the village start to come to the meeting, and they're complaining about water, and they make their point by smashing earthen pots in front of, you know, the senior men in the village, and lo and behold, a month later, you have the fixing of the hand pump, and so on. So what went right there is it started with a mix of policy. I think Michael is right that, you know, we've got to think policy, but also at the very grassroots of society, people interacting with each other even when it's uncomfortable. Right? Even when it's hard, even when it's difficult to come out to a meeting, even when it's difficult to discuss something. This is what I tell my students at Georgetown. If you got through a day where some moment was not a little bit uncomfortable, you did not get your money's worth out of your education today. Right? Like, again, you've got to put yourself out there and challenge your own ideas. And I think more conversation at all levels of society, but certainly the grassroots. And I walk around and, you know, all of us, whether we're at airport or wherever we are guilty of sitting like this, and that's right. Probably not good for us
right.
in society.
Right. Marion, what do you think? What can we do to change this?
I'll give three reasons or three ways that we could do it with a descending in the descending probability. So, let me start with the one that we can do, and that is that journalists can start adding sentences about long-term trends. So yes, you can definitely say that car accidents have increased by 50% since last year, but then if you would please include a sentence, not you specifically, if journalists could include also a sentence saying that the long-term trends over the last 50 years has been a downward one, it won't take that much of a column space. The second and less probable is one where we start learning history again. History is something of a nuisance to a lot of students. A lot of people consider it boring. It is not taught to the extent that it used to be, but having some sense of what the world was like as late as 200 years ago would be very nice. And then the last one, which really applies to probably a very tiny sliver of highly educated and very introspective people, would be to be aware of these negativity biases that Bobby's book is going to be about. So if I'm reacting to a certain thing in a certain way, I can sort of step back and say, why am I doing this? You can sort of psychoanalyze yourself to say, well, you know, there is the availability heuristic. There is the problem that bad is always stronger than good. That we are, my point being that you can always say to yourself, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I should be more optimistic. What am I doing wrong? But again, that's something that probably is not applicable to general public.
There's a great book on this that many of you have probably read by Hans Rosling. He wrote just before he passed away a couple years ago called Factfulness, and it gets into 10 different biases that we have of why we see the world not by facts, but through these biases. And it's a great read. It's only about 250 pages, but it goes exactly through that. And his whole point is that by doing this, we can be more conscious of the biases that we have and therefore try to trend more towards factfulness on this. Michael, what do you think? What can we do?
You know, as somebody who works in journalism, I mean, this to me is a big part of what I try to do in my job, and I think it's a huge factor. I think it's very hard to get past some of these biases about, but I think journalists have a really important role to play in educating the public, and I think, frankly, we're not doing a great job of it. I think, you know, this is something that journalists in general, especially who cover foreign policy, need to do a better job of. It's going to be very difficult because you have politicians, I think, really have from both sides of the aisle, I think, who have an incentive to hype up threats and hype up dangers. But I think journalists can inoculate the public somewhat from that if they make an effort to do so.
Bobby? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, the focus of my book is on domestic things in lots of different countries, like murder rates, deaths from terrorism, immigration, teenage pregnancy, those types of things. So it's not the kind of, the big global trends. It's more close to home, but it's exactly the same sorts of patterns. And the key thing is that means that in the US there's a tradition called rational, which is a long-term academic tradition, which means that they asked similar questions in 1940s, 1950s, 1960s America, asking about things like unemployment rates. What was the level of unemployment rate, and getting people to guess that. And the thing that shows was that people were just as wrong and just as overly negative back in the 1940s as they are today. So the average guess was about 35%. Unemployment rates in the 1940s. The average guess today is 32% in America. When at the time of the survey, it was about 6%. So there's massive inflation of unemployment rates, which was, you know, some of the president kind of pushed that a bit as well. You can see the interaction between people's natural negativity bias and Donald Trump on the campaign trail saying he thinks the unemployment rate is 35, 42%. Right. Don't believe the figures. So you can see that type of interaction. So the thing that I take from that is that this is a long-term baked-in bias, that it's not changed since 1940s America until now. It's going to be very difficult to move it along. And the reason is that it's systemic, that it's not to do just with the biases in our brain, which Hans Rosling and others have so brilliantly outlined. And it's not just to do with our post-truth, alternative facts, fake news environment. It's to do with how those two things interact and reinforce each other, which has been a feature of political and media discussion for many decades. It's not just brand new, this type of approach. So getting it to change is really, really difficult. But It feels scary to admit it's a system, but as soon as you do, you start to think there is no one. This is not about critical literacy or education. This is not about getting Facebook to clean up its act on how it treats information. This is about looking across the spectrum. And then you start to think there are actually things you can do in that. And you do have to then start to think, I do a lot of work with fact checkers, the fact-checking networks around the world. And they are trying to build more of that kind of veracity or rigor of the information that's returned into the system. This is not about fact-checking after the fact. Can we get it built into the system in a way? And then can we, on the human side, build it into our education systems to have more of those types of skills that we need for this new information environment, starting young with people and then working all the way through. So those two things need to be looked at together with interventions in both in different sorts of ways.
One point, and then I'm going to ask everyone one final thought that they may want to leave the audience with, and I'll start with you, Marion. But before we do that, I wanted to pick up on Shireen's point about the importance of getting people together in dialogue and talk and discussion. Larry Diamond, who's a professor out at Stanford, has been working on this issue, and he's, with some colleagues, gotten groups of people together in the United States, groups of about 20 or 25, to stay together for 2 days, actually, and he picks people from a wide demographic, politics, from their political views and their demographic background and everything else to try to mirror the U.S. population at large, and gets their opinions before this starts, and they have very extreme opinions, very negative views, everything's horrible, and then they spend a couple of days together talking about these issues, and they ask their opinions afterwards, and they've all come to move towards each other a little bit and are much more moderate in their views, much more positive about working together to find solutions. And it has to do with getting people to talk. And in the old town hall meetings, people talked. The idea of public debate and discourse is doing that. And I do worry that social media and other kinds of things cut that off, because it's not a platform meant for discussion and debate. It's meant for just kind of making quick points. So somehow, if we can get back to more formats of having more open discussion, I think we can move forward on this a little bit. But our time is running down, but I just wanted to go through and ask everybody for one final thought that they'd like to leave with the audience on this. And Marion, we'll start with you.
Well, building on what you said about face-to-face, one possible answer to the great division in this country, and perhaps some others, be a return to a more localized decision-making. Here in the United States, rediscovery of the Founding Fathers' wisdom about federalism, and perhaps even taking the decision-making down to a lower level, where you are not deciding about some abstract matters that Washington should address, such as give everybody free healthcare and free education and free this or that, but where you actually have to make decisions that are tied to real budgets of real communities interacting with real people face to face. I think that we could probably blunten the edges of public discussion, which is why Switzerland is such a well-functioning country.
It's an interesting point, and it backed up by some work that people, for example, on the immigration issue, there's a lot of work that shows that people don't think it's such a big issue in their own community, but they're sure it's a big issue everywhere else. And everybody around the country thinks it's a big issue someplace else. And the more localized you can get, the more you can avoid that kind of bias. Shireen?
Yeah, the word I'd like to leave the audience with is participation. Right? Like the evidence is clear from academics as well as policymakers and just grassroots communities across the world. Participation is valuable. It's valuable because of its intrinsic value. It's valuable because of its instrumental value. But creating incentives for people to get out there and participate in their community is critical.
Great. Thank you, Shireen. Bobby?
Yeah, I suppose the danger in pointing out the biases that we're subject to, and that our view of the world is much more emotional than factual realities we see in an emotional light, and we kind of filter those. The danger with that is that we end up thinking that everyone is like an identity-driven automaton who is just focused on their own emotional reaction from their own tribe and is unwilling to open up to other information, and that facts are useless and it's all about stories and emotion. And I think that's not true. For lots of the reasons that Shireen says, and others have said, is that when you do get people together around particular issues, you see that people can change their minds on things, that they are not entirely driven by their identity or their political views, and that you can get movement and get people to bring people together in some ways without them having to overturn their whole worldview. You can just shift people by. So I think that the main thing is to be optimistic about the human ability to understand new information, take it on board, and adapt to it. As we shouldn't think that all these books and all this analysis says that we're all stuck exactly where we are.
Good. Michael, your final thoughts.
You know, I think the key point I make here, I think, is we can sort of rethink what the words national security mean, because we tend to think of national security as something that involves what happens over there, not what happens over here. And in the recent book I wrote, Clear and Present Safety, available to all your favorite booksellers, we talk a lot about how things are improving around the world, and yet in this country, things are moving in the opposite direction. That we are living shorter lives, that we have greater inequality, that we have worse health outcomes, worse infrastructure, worse educational outcomes. You know, when national debates have a long involved not just what happens with the size of our military or what happens overseas, but also what's happening in this country and the strength of our economy, the strength of our populace. And I think one thing that we need to sort of think about moving forward is not to be so focused on these threats from overseas, but think about what's happening that threatens Americans here at home. Is it guns? Is it drugs? Is it obesity? Is it bad educational outcomes? What have you? And once we think about it in those terms, I think it's a really important way to reframe the national security debate to the issues that I think we should be addressing here at home, but I think also really affect our quality of life, but also sort of the underpinnings of America's economic power.
Well, so you all have your marching orders now on what to do going forward in terms of trying to engage in more dialogue and talk about these more positive trends. And it's not a point of just trying to be optimistic or naive about. It's actually much more fundamental on that the importance of people understanding this is to recognize how much progress has been made, even though there are many problems in the world, and that the right solution to that is to use that great progress as the basis for understanding how we can continue to make more progress going forward, and not just throw everything out when we've made so much progress on the basis that we've got today. So please join me in thanking the members of the panel for being with us today. Thanks for your attention.